Hello, my name is Al Manville. I'm a certified wildlife biologist. My topic today is radiofrequency radiation effects on wildlife and their habitats, the need for serious consideration and immediate action. A shout out to my two distinguished colleagues without whom our EMF findings would not have been possible, B. Blake Levitt and Dr. Henry Lai. The senior authors are our two most recent peer-reviewed papers on the impacts of non-ionizing EMFs on wildlife and plants. Ambient levels of non-ionizing EMFs have risen sharply over the past 80 years, growing currently exponentially, creating a novel chronic energetic exposure for wildlife and humans, which previously did not exist. Contrary to popular opinion, we know a great deal about how non-ionizing EMFs affect non-human species. We've been using animal and plant models in research since at least the 1930s. Non-ionizing EMF radiation has traditionally been thought not to have enough energy to knock electrons off atoms and molecules, unlike its ionizing counterparts, damage limited only to electric shock and tissue heating. However, EMF is capable of a host of potentially harmful biological effects below ionizing radiation thresholds. Very low intensities of radiation, barely above natural background levels, can and are causing biological effects. These can include things like DNA strand breaks, cancers and benign growths, metabolic changes, animal disorientation, including during migration, fertility problems, behavioral abnormalities, impacts to food finding, reproduction, mating, nest and den building, territorial maintenance and defense, and longevity and survivorship. These have been exhibited in laboratory test animals, domestic livestock, and in wildlife. Biological effects have been seen broadly across all taxa and frequencies at vanishingly low intensities. For example, in the study by DiCarlo et al. In 2002, they exposed chicken embryos to 2 hours of exposure at 1/10,000th amount of non-ionizing radiation emitted from the standard digital cell phones. And these exposures caused deaths in some chicken embryos, while the controls were unaffected. These impacts likely were due to oxidative stress. In Levitt et al. 2021, we document a number of these deleterious effects from over 130 studies referenced in some 1,000 sources cited in our papers. We're seeing low-level EMF exposure effects at the ecosystem level as well. These include at wilderness sites, national parks, and other protected areas. These represent troubling yet generally unstudied exposures to plants, animals, and their habitats. Virtually all terrestrial plants and animals and some marine organisms are inadvertently impacted by exposure from EMF, including from electrosmog. Due to unique physiologies, some flora and fauna are sensitive to exogenous EMFs in ways that may surpass human reactivity. Given the growing level of EMFs likely affecting wildlife, including the explosion of the 5G technologies, the urgency to address them could not be more pressing. It's time to recognize ambient EMF as a novel form of air pollution and develop rules at the regulatory agencies, that including the EPA, Federal Communications Commission, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Department of Agriculture, Department of Commerce, and certainly others that designate air as habitat. So EMF can be regulated like other pollutants. Radiation standards used by the FCC are over 35 years out of date, still based on thermal heating, which, as recently ordered by the federal court, must be changed. Meanwhile, we have no EMF exposure standards for wildlife, including long-term chronic low-level EMF exposure guidelines. With the ongoing sixth major extinction epoch, EMF impacts to wildlife will only become additive, increasing the already daunting challenges from the many other forms of cumulative effects. To address these challenges, we need to use the ALARA principles, attaining radiation levels as low as reasonably achievable. In our 2024 radiotelemetry paper, we suggested keeping radiotelemeters in sleep mode where feasible, reducing tracking gear and the number of target animals being used, and reducing frequency of gear use and the subsequent EMF exposures that result from the gear use. From a personal standpoint, I was trained by the U.S. Navy's radio school during my U.S. military service as a Mandarin Chinese linguist, and more recently, I was trained by an FAA-certified pilot instructor. I'm now licensed by the FAA as a private pilot. I've served for 17 years as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Avian Lead on all things human impacting migratory birds, including impact from radiation. I helped convince the Department of Interior to request that the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, a part of the Department of Commerce, reduce radiation cumulative impact studies on their emergency broadcast system and assess its impacts to migratory birds, something which had not previously been accomplished. The resultant environmental impact statement was begun in 2014 during the Obama administration. However, it languished and sadly was terminated under Trump. The efforts need to be reinitiated. After retiring from Fish and Wildlife Service, I worked as a private consultant fighting the impacts of cell towers, primarily on migratory birds and bats. For example, in addition to collision impacts, the radiation from cell towers is known to attract, disorient, and affect survivorship of migratory birds, creating yet more challenges. Unfortunately, the proverbial radiation genie has long ago been released from the bottle. More significant change will be challenging. Here's some suggestions for change. We need a government-wide response that treats EMF as air pollution, addressing air as habitat. This is under the realm of what's also called air ecology, or also known aeroecology. We need radiation exposure guidelines for wildlife, including for long-term, chronic, low-level exposures. We need steps to expand the use of the ALAR principles, again, as low as reasonably achievable. The public needs to speak up and challenge the status quo. This can involve voting for politicians who commit to making positive change, making sure that these commitments are honored. This will require a massive public and government-wide engagement if change is to occur. If we don't try, the alternatives could be pretty grim. Thank you very much.